We had a murder which was done with a particularly gruesome amount of violence, what we would typically refer to as a rage killing. Everybody loved him, no possible enemy, so why would somebody want to murder him?
Y'all want to kill him? Come get me. I'm the one who did it.
Let's go ahead to the 25th of June. That's the day we got involved.
I knew I was down there to murder him, man. I come there for a reason to kill him. You know, and I told him, I'm sending you to hell, boy.
It was very shocking. Describing himself as being the murderer and the sole person responsible just didn't make sense. It just didn't sound reasonable. There are two basic motives: plain old-fashioned greed, love gone wrong. Put those two things together, it's like pouring gasoline on a fire.
I love this lady on my heart, because she has buffaloed me.
Nestled in the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains, Huntington, West Virginia is a quiet community with deep roots.
This town sits right on the Ohio River, so it's a pretty location.
It's mostly middle-class, working-class people. It's a close, tight-knit community.
On the afternoon of June 25th, 1998, local resident Denny Aldridge receives a concerning phone call from his brother Millard's wife, Patricia Aldridge.
My wife answered the phone and kind of quiet for a minute, and she said, "You need to talk to Trish, there's something wrong with your brother, he's missing." I got on the phone with her. I said, "If you don't know where he's at and you can't go home," I said, "call the police."
20 minutes later, a Huntington police officer arrives at the Aldridge residence. Patricia explains that she last saw her 42-year-old husband at 7:30 that morning.
My brother was supposed to have a recall on his car done at 8 o'clock.
She stated that he had taken the van that she usually drove and parked it out on the street, and then had given her a hug and told her he'd meet her for lunch at about 11 o'clock. Patricia had gone to Walmart and to the bank and had returned home shortly before 11 o'clock, and Millard was not there.
She then proceeded on to work. Patricia said that while she was at work, she made several phone calls trying to find Millard, was not able to do so.
Millard, you could pretty much set a clock by. He was very reliable on his daily life.
She became very worried, and so about 2 o'clock that afternoon, she returned home.
Patricia says her concerns grew when she entered the couple's detached garage.
She went back to the garage to see if he was there, and she found bloodstains on the floor. She then contacted her brother and called the police.
So what they originally thought might be a missing person became something more sinister in nature.
When detectives arrive, they begin processing the scene and speak with Patricia.
She said that Millard was a cameraman for WSAZ. At that point, I recognized who he was.
He would come to the courthouse and interview prosecutors after the conclusion of cases. He always seemed like a very nice guy.
Born and raised in Huntington, Millard Aldridge came from humble beginnings.
Our life was simple. We were country people. My dad worked every day. My mother was a housewife, and she did side jobs at times. I had one brother, and I have one sister. We're only 3 years apart in ages, so we were pretty tight-knit. We went to CK High School, but unfortunately, he didn't get to graduate from there. My dad had got hurt and was off work, and both of us ended up having to quit school and get jobs to make sure that we didn't lose our home. He had got an interview for a janitor's position for WSAZ Channel 3, and luckily he got it.
With a keen eye for photography, Millard quickly found a new career path.
He worked his way up to be a journalist, photojournalist.
He loved what he did. He felt like he was making a difference in our community by, helping report the news in the Huntington area.
Him becoming a photojournalist like he did was destined to be his thing. That was his calling.
2 years into his career at WSAZ, Millard married his high school sweetheart.
They had a little girl first, and then they had a little boy.
Millard was a great father. He loved his kids. He took care of his kids.
Millard was such a caring person. He never put himself first. He was just an all-around great man.
He gave it everything he had to make it work, but they ended up getting a divorce. He was probably single for about 4 years, and then he met Trish. Next thing I know, he's in love, and he wants to marry her.
Trish was always out for a good time, always laughing and making jokes. I thought she was great because she was making Millard happy.
She seemed like she was going to be a true partner for him for the rest of his life.
Patricia had one child from a previous marriage, and he treated her, Jennifer, like his own daughter. She loved Millard to death. It might not have been her birth dad, but that was her dad.
And then they had a son shortly after they were married.
He was happy and proud. That's what he wanted out of his life. He wanted to be a loving father and a husband.
While Millard continued to build a successful career at WSAZ, Patricia pursued her own interests.
She was real good sewing and stuff like that. She had her own business, which was called a Stitch in Time.
She would make things for people, costumes and outfits and blankets and different things. Millard and Trish, they seemed happy as a couple, like they were gonna grow old together and sit on the front porch in a rocking chair.
But after nearly 2 decades of marriage, the couple's future is suddenly in jeopardy.
With the finding of the bloodstains in the garage, that elevated things quite a bit.
Once the area was secured, then the forensic investigators came in.
I observed a 55-gallon size garbage can that had been turned over. Looked like a struggle took place.
The blood splatter indicated that this was a very violent attack. It looked more like what we would typically refer to as a rage killing.
Coming up, authorities discover a second crime scene.
Generally speaking, the purpose for burning a vehicle is to destroy evidence.
And a tip to law enforcement puts a suspect in their crosshairs.
When human emotions are set ablaze like this, you don't know where the fire's going to go.
Hours after 42-year-old Millard Aldridge was reported missing by his wife, Patricia, investigators in Huntington, West Virginia, find evidence of a violent attack in the couple's garage.
We didn't find any weapons inside the garage, but there was a blood swipe on the floor. It looked to me like somebody had tried to use something to maybe clean up the blood pool.
What was reported missing from the garage was Millard Aldridge and Millard Aldridge's vehicle, but there were no reports that anything else significant was taken from the garage.
There were no signs of break-in at all. Didn't appear to be a robbery gone bad. Someone had gained entry, either had access to the garage or was familiar with it in some way.
Investigators canvassed the Aldridge's neighborhood, hoping that someone saw Millard leave home on his own.
This is the Westmoreland neighborhood of Huntington. It's a kind of a bed and breakfast family neighborhood, so for this to have happened was very shocking. The canvass turned up no results. There was nothing unusual that was noted either during that day, the night before.
The next step the investigators would take would be to put him into the National Crime Database, the NCIC, and it alerts law enforcement agencies to be on the lookout for this missing person or this vehicle.
Trish, she was worried about Millard, nervous because she didn't know where he was at. The whole family was hoping that he was still alive, but everybody was just in shock, total shock.
I felt I had to do something to try to help find my brother. Me and my sons and my nephew, we jumped in my van and we went on back roads that we used to run when we was kids.
Our hearts were sinking, hoping still that he would be found alive, but there was less hope of that happening.
Nearly 24 hours into their search, Huntington police receive a call from neighboring Cabell County.
A burnt vehicle was found up on 8th Street Road. Immediately, there was the suspicion that this might be Millard's missing car.
The vehicle was destroyed to such an extent that they could not make any determination of what make, model, or serial number might exist there.
There was a license plate that had been burned in half, but you could still read the first 3 digits. And the first 3 digits on that license plate did correspond to the first 3 digits of Millard Aldridge's vehicle.
So it doesn't take a rocket scientist to put 2 and 2 together. It was pretty safe to assume that this was Millard's vehicle. Generally speaking, the purpose for burning a vehicle is to destroy evidence. So it was prudent to do a search in that area. We had a lot of people out there. We had people from the Sheriff's Department, a volunteer group. The news had camera crews out there covering as much of the search as they could. A lot of the people that he worked with, they were all there. And it was a somber moment for everybody.
West Virginia State Police participated in the search of the area, and it included cadaver dogs.
Less than a quarter mile into the woods, investigators make a gruesome discovery.
The body was maybe 10 to 15 feet over an embankment over the hillside.
It was in a state of decomposition.
And it was pretty apparent that there were some severe injuries to the face and head, enough to the point that he could not be immediately identified.
We got the phone call, said, we found a body and we think it's Millard. I was asked to go help identify the body. Now, the hardest thing to do is identify your brother, but the only way I could do it was because when he was a young man, he thought he wanted a tattoo, an initial M on his shoulder. And another thing, he had a scar on his right leg, and that's basically how I was able to identify my brother. I didn't know what to do then. I mean, I kind of fell to my knees.
That immediately changed things from a missing person to a homicide investigation. When the body was carried out of the woods, Patricia was there with a couple of family members, and she did break down, kind of collapsed.
She was just absolutely devastated. I mean, crying beyond consoling. It was just a sick feeling. How could someone do something to take his life?
The sad irony of Millard's career, which was to put the stories of others on camera, is that his horrible and untimely death played out on camera and in the media that he served.
They had EMTs to transport Millard to the medical examiner's office to have an autopsy done on him.
The autopsy revealed that the cause of death was the severe blunt force trauma to the head.
This is consistent with the blood evidence that was found at the crime scene, and the ME's report described a dozen injuries, one of which was so severe it caused several fractures to the head and face. For somebody to be not just beaten to death, but beaten multiple times to death indicates that there was a lot of rage involved in this crime.
It didn't look like it could be a random type of crime. It looked more overkill. It seems very personal.
It was somebody of either size or strength, or both. And so clearly, we're probably not looking at a woman or somebody of small stature. That caused us to go back and talk to family members and try to get an idea of who might be responsible for this type of a crime.
We're racking our brain trying to figure out who would want to hurt him. He was the best man you could ask for as a friend, a father, a son, a brother. Nobody in the family or the neighborhood would ever guess that somebody would hate him. Nobody.
While interviewing Millard's family, detectives sit down with his 18-year-old stepdaughter, Jennifer.
Jennifer had information she might be able to provide with regard to the relationship between her mother and father.
By all outward appearances, this was an ideal marriage.
But Jennifer exposes a crack in her family's picture-perfect veneer.
In speaking to her, detectives learned that Patricia had an affair with a guy named Mitchell Vickers.
Given the statements, they have to explore Mitch Vickers. Who's Mitch Vickers? Is he the type of person that could have harmed Millard Aldridge because of this affair?
2 days into Millard Aldridge's murder investigation, authorities in Huntington, West Virginia have a promising lead. According to Millard's stepdaughter, Jennifer, his wife, Patricia, was having an affair with a man named Mitchell Vickers.
In speaking to her, detectives learned that Patricia would meet with Mitchell Vickers at Jennifer's apartment. Jennifer had disclosed to us that she'd having knowledge about the affair, just her general dislike and suspicions of Vickers, and this box of letters that she got from Patricia, a bunch of love letters between Patricia and Vickers. Jennifer mentioned that Vickers had threatened her if she disclosed the relationship to Millard Aldridge. She was scared of him. We ran his name, ended up pulling a jacket on him. Vickers had a fairly extensive record. He was what you might call a career criminal.
Mitch Vickers was from the Barbersville area of Cabell County, which is just east of the city of Huntington. He'd been involved in a lot of thefts and things like that, and had had legal trouble in Florida and had been incarcerated there.
He had recently, we discovered, been convicted of a couple of burglaries and had worked out a plea deal. Having pled guilty to those charges, he had asked for a delayed report date because his mother was in bad health.
He was permitted to be released from jail and was to report on June 29th to the authorities in Cabell County to be transported to the prison.
Detectives realized Mitchell had been released nearly a week before Millard was reported missing.
Mitchell Vickers is a person who is very large. He is strong. He's capable of extreme violence. And so the nature of the injuries combined with the knowledge of the affair immediately moved Mitchell Vickers up to the top of the possible suspects list. It raises questions. With the discovery of the affair, it's now necessary to go back and talk to Patricia.
Detectives immediately contact Patricia at her home and press her about the state of her marriage.
Very shortly after the investigators begin to question her, she admits to the affair with Mitch Vickers.
Patricia admits that the affair began less than a year earlier in December of 1997. But her ties to Mitchell Vickers began decades earlier.
Mitch Vickers and Patricia Aldridge had a relationship when they were much younger, back in the 70s. Mitch Vickers had moved away and they separated, but when Mitch returned to town in 1997, they were reacquainted by one of Patricia's friends.
They reconnected, and that grew from there into a full-fledged physical affair.
I have to believe that the attraction to Mitchell Vickers, to Patricia, was the fact that he was almost the polar opposite of Millard. Whereas Millard was a stable guy with a job, was a law-abiding guy, and Mitchell Vickers was a bad boy, in and out of prison.
Patricia talked about Vickers being rearrested in February of '98. And so when he goes back into jail, she told detectives that she ended the affair with Vickers.
She insists that she's not involved, she's innocent, she loved her husband, and at that point, Patricia indicates that she's not sure if Mitchell Vickers is involved.
As detectives are wrapping up their interview, Patricia steps away to take a phone call.
Patricia says, "Hey, I've got somebody who wants to talk to you."
The person identifies as Mitchell Vickers on the phone. And he said, "I'm the one that did it. I'm the one that killed that SOB."
He said, "Just leave my lady alone. She didn't have nothing to do with it."
The obvious reaction immediately is just amazement.
We didn't know if it was a love story gone bad. We didn't know exactly what the motive was.
We had a little bit of a suspicion that perhaps Patricia had called him and convinced him to talk to the police. In addition to confessing, Vickers had also offered to surrender himself and gave us an address, a location to find him.
The detectives immediately leave to try to make contact with Mr. Vickers.
At this point, he's not just a suspect, he's the suspect.
Coming up, detectives come face to face with Mitchell Vickers. And an unexpected motive emerges.
I love this lady from my heart. How can I go to jail knowing that this ass is going to be out here beating on her?
I never had a confession that was quite like this.
He had no remorse whatsoever.
48 hours after Huntington police recovered Millard Aldridge's body, his wife's lover, 40-year-old Mitchell Vickers, surrenders to authorities.
He gives a location for them to pick him up. When they encounter him, he's in a truck. He gets out of the truck. He's shirtless, and they obviously put him in a cruiser and transported him to be interviewed.
The detectives take him to the barracks in Cabell County, and Mitchell Vickers voluntarily gives a statement at that time. In his statement, Mitchell Vickers talked about his relationship with Patricia Aldridge and the fact that they were in love with each other.
I run around with a friend of mine. Their girlfriend knows Trish, and somehow my name came up. And we decided that we would meet and just kind of discuss what you've been doing with your life for the last 18 years. First time we met at the Cono Lodge. It's before Christmas. And it's very obvious we still had feelings for each other. One thing led to another, you know, and I fell back in love with her.
Vickers stated that the reason why he killed Millard Aldridge was because Patricia had told him that Millard was very abusive.
She has told me things that, for instance, that Mildred was nothing but a drug. He beat on her, he slaps her around, he treats her like a piece of.
According to Mitchell, things came to a head when he was recently sentenced for his burglary charges.
I went berserk. I went crazy. You know, I love this lady from my heart. How can I go to jail knowing that this ass is going to be out here beating on her? And I decided, man, no, I'm going to prison. I'm going to put a stop to this. You know, I mean, I can't have her. You know I can't. But I'm goddamn, I'm not going to let nobody else have her.
What did you decide to do?
I found her address. I went down there. I walked in her garage approximately 4:30 that morning.
And how did you get into their garage?
The door was open. I waited and waited. Daylight came, and it was probably 7, 8 o'clock. I guess he finally come out of the garage and carrying a bag of trash with him.
Vickers said that when Millard entered the garage, Vickers attacked him, first with a pipe, and then beat him with a claw hammer, and then stabbed him with a screwdriver.
And then I grabbed a crescent wrench, which was hanging on the wall. I grabbed it. I started beating him in the head. He was screaming, Trish, help! Trish, help! And I told him, I'm sending you to hell, boy. You.
This one was a chilling confession because of the cold and calculating manner in which he spoke about murdering someone. I never had a confession that was quite like this.
When I knew that he was dead, I drug him around, threw him in the trunk of his car. I walked over because I was trying to clean up my mess. I let his blood trail from hell.
Okay. What did you do after that?
Vickers describes driving the car up to 8th Street Road near Skyview Drive. He disposed of the body, dropping it over the side of the hill, and then poured gasoline on the car and set it on fire. Then hitched a ride back to town.
I didn't know I could do anything like this, but I cannot let somebody beat up on somebody I love.
He seemed to be extremely proud. He leaned back in the chair, arms folded, shirtless, as if he were bragging about what he'd done.
Almost as if he's trying to make himself out to be the hero rather than the bad guy in this.
Trish ain't got nothing to do with this. Now I'm saying this all on my own. Trish didn't know anything about this.
Vickers was extremely adamant about taking all of the blame himself, and that just even more raised suspicions because if Patricia wasn't involved, there would be no reason for him to even mention her.
Following his confession, Mitchell is transported to the Huntington Police Department to be charged with first-degree murder. News crews eagerly await his arrival.
The suspect reportedly called police to confess to the murder of WSAZ photographer Millard Aldridge. Where does he belong?
Long in hell, just where I sent him.
I was at Millard's house with Trish and Millard's mom, and it come on the news. And Mitch Vickers is on there. They've got him in handcuffs. He's cussing everybody, saying that Millard was a terrible person. He deserved to die. He was a wife beater and a child abuser. I mean, we're all in shock. Glad that they arrested him. But where did he get this information from?
He also apparently had a motive. He said it was over a relationship with a woman.
When investigators circle back to Millard's family members, they say that, in hindsight, they believe Millard must have been suspicious of his wife's infidelity.
I could tell that something was bothering him a lot. Patricia wasn't really paying attention to him like she was, and she wasn't the happy-go-lucky smile. I think he might have kind of knew, but he didn't want to know. He didn't want it to be real.
You could tell Patricia was a little bit nervous about all of it, but she was still trying to act like the innocent person in all this. A lot of what I felt was a gut feeling that she wasn't being truthful.
Family members are adamant that Millard has never been abusive.
Everybody that knows him knows he wasn't.
All of that kind of raised red flags. Everything we had up to that point said, no, that's not true.
Since Patricia had allegedly fed this information to Mitchell, investigators have growing doubts about her story. Looking for clues, they compare her previous statements to the forensic evidence found at the scene and hit pay dirt.
Luminol was applied to the crime scene in the garage, and it was apparent that there had been a vehicle parked where the violence had taken place. It cast a lot of doubt to the explanation Patricia gave about Millard parking the van in front of the house before leaving. So we wanted to take a closer look at the van.
There are a lot of unanswered questions at this point.
Patricia had made a statement that the last time she saw Millard was when he pulled her vehicle from the garage around to the front of the house and parked it along the curb. We went back to examine Patricia's van, and it didn't take long to find some blood stains. There was a couple of stains that were on the passenger side rearview mirror, but then I looked up in the wheel well up above the tire, and that's where I saw a lot of impact spatter, meaning that portion of the vehicle would have been adjacent to the beating as the beating was taking place.
That says the van had to be in the garage when the blood got on it.
It made it very plain and obvious to me at that point that she was lying.
Investigators immediately bring Patricia Aldridge into the station for questioning.
At this time, Patricia was confronted with this evidence, and she indicates that she wants a lawyer.
Clearly, she knew about it and had some kind of involvement in it.
Investigators don't have enough evidence to hold Patricia, so they let her go. On June 27th, a local couple contacts police after seeing Vickers' arrest on the news.
The day after Mitchell Vickers was arrested, the police received a telephone call from Cheryl Kowalski.
Cheryl Kowalski is a friend of Patricia's. Cheryl's husband, Ronald, had spent time in jail with Mitchell Vickers.
Cheryl says in January of 1998, Mitchell contacted her husband Ronald with a proposal.
Cheryl tells police that Mitchell Vickers had approached her husband and offered money to kill Millard Aldridge.
So detectives interviewed Ronald Kowalski. He provided the corroborating information.
He had a video that showed Patricia Aldridge and Mitchell Vickers at his home Christmas of 1997.
Patricia was sitting on Vickers' lap and kissing him, hugging him, essentially carrying on like teenagers.
A month later, Mitchell had returned to Ron and Cheryl's home.
Ron said that Vickers had approached him, asked him if he wanted to earn some money.
He had been offered $7,500 to kill Millard Aldridge, but he refuses.
According to Ronald, it wasn't just Mitchell who wanted Millard dead.
According to Ron, there was another time where he was approached, this time Patricia Aldridge and Vickers together. Patricia asked Ron if he would be willing to kill her husband and described that she wanted him out of the picture.
The statement of the Kowalskis are important because it doesn't isolate Mitchell Vickers as being a lone person seeking to have Millard Aldridge killed. It clearly shows that this was a joint enterprise on their part.
As for why Patricia wanted her husband dead, her friends believe they know the answer.
Patricia had described that the reason she couldn't leave her husband was because it all boiled down to money. She couldn't make it financially on her own.
When investigators obtain the Aldridges' financial records, they learn why.
Patricia was a seamstress. She had a business called Stitch and Time that eventually went bankrupt and closed.
Millard Aldridge worked for WSAZ TV here in Huntington, and they had a policy that if her employee got killed, they would pay a year's salary to that employee's beneficiary. I was talking with the bookkeeper at WSAZ, and I will never forget what the lady said to me. She said, "Honey, that's not where the money is." She said, "It's in his 401k. I said, "How much?" And she said, "Around $250,000.
Mitchell Vickers is in custody for the confessed murder of Millard Aldridge. But now friends of Millard's wife, Patricia, have come forward accusing her of being a co-conspirator.
Patricia indicates to some friends that she was not financially able to make it on her own by merely divorcing him, and that eliminating him was the solution to her problem. she would have been the beneficiary of the 401k and the life insurance policy. So there was at least $300,000 there that she would have received. On July 1, 1998, through his attorney, Mitchell Vickers had made contact with the prosecuting attorney's office and agreed to give an additional statement.
He's been informed that the original motive that he gave, the belief that Millard was abusive towards Patricia, was false. Once he's confronted with that information, it becomes clear to him that, at least in some part, he was used by Patricia. And so he's no longer shielding her from everything that happened.
I love Trish. I love this lady from my heart. Okay? She has loved me. She got me to believing, without a doubt, her husband was a real prick. I don't even know the man.
He detailed the motive for the crime being the financial motive.
She'd been wanting to get rid of him for a long time. She offered me $10,000. She asked me to do it. Finally, I agreed to it.
And so he describes Patricia having set things up at the house. She disabled a motion light. She unlocked the door to the garage.
He explained that he committed the act after Millard walked into the garage, and that he stuffed Millard's body in the trunk, took the car up to A Street Road, Skyview Drive area, dumped Millard's body out.
She was right behind me in her van with gas all over her car, inside and out. Torched it, jumped in her van. We took off.
Patricia then drove him to Walmart, where she gets him a change of clothes.
And she took me from there, took me over to a buddy of mine's house on high and dropped me home. That's when I guess she went home and did a report.
So the additional information that Vickers now gives us further cemented Patricia's involvement in this murder.
She is a principal of the crime, just like the person who wielded the hammer. So at this point, she will be charged with first-degree murder.
On July 3rd, Millard Aldridge is laid to rest surrounded by friends and family, including Patricia.
We're at the funeral home, and her still doing the boo-hoo, poor widow, what about me thing.
We all knew that she was involved. It was so hard for all of us to just grin and bear it.
We got to the cemetery, and they lowered his coffin into the ground, and we started filling it up.
That's when the police came up and arrested her. Poetic justice of her getting arrested at the cemetery. That was just karma.
Just a week after her husband Millard was found beaten to death, his wife was arrested and charged with first-degree murder.
Despite confessing to Millard's murder, Mitchell Vickers takes his chances at trial on May 4th, 1999.
We had corroborating evidence, but the most compelling evidence was his confession.
I knew I was down here murdering man. I come here for a reason to kill him.
Mitchell Vickers was found guilty of first-degree murder, and he was sentenced to life without mercy.
We would have preferred the death penalty, but West Virginia doesn't really have that on the table.
Patricia Aldridge's trial gets underway on August 24th, 1999.
So we had to connect all those dots to clearly show that she was intimately involved in the planning and the murder of her husband.
It was hard to find out how much involvement she had. Just having Millard murdered by her lover was bad enough. But to find out that she helped plan everything?
A death for hire. That's what it was. She was the mastermind of it all.
Her selfishness, her greed, Everything is about her.
Mitch killed Millard because he loved Trish.
Oh, gross.
He would do anything for her.
Well, affairs deal with human emotions, and human emotions are set ablaze like this. You don't know where the fire's going to go.
On August 26th, Patricia takes the stand, attempting to refute the state's claim that this was a cold-blooded conspiracy.
Patricia Aldridge maintained that she may have been involved with Mitchell Vickers, but that he took it upon himself to do this. Mr. Vickers testified in her trial and recanted his second statement that she was involved.
It's just total selfish stupidity on my part to drag an innocent person in such a serious charge situation that I'm in. She didn't do anything bad.
In Mitchell Vickers' world, one of the worst things you can be is a snitch. And as much as anything, he may well have testified at that trial to rid himself of being a snitch. Mitch Vickers truly loved her, and I think he tried to save her one last time.
Following a 3-day trial, the jury reaches a verdict.
Patricia Aldridge was found guilty of first-degree murder. Her sentence was life in prison with no possibility of parole.
They got exactly what they deserved. And I don't lose a minute of sleep over it.
There are two basic motives that come forward in this particular case. One is money, plain old-fashioned greed. The other is love gone wrong. Put those two things together, it's like pouring gasoline on a fire.
I think it was just a fatal attraction that they just couldn't get out of their system.
Patricia, I really don't understand how you could do this and tear a family up and take a great man, not just from us, but your kids, his kids. How could you do this? I just wish he was here. I wish he was here.
My brother will be remembered in our family, to me, as one of the most loving, caring, devoted persons that you could ask for. Hopefully his legacy, people will still remember it and it will live on. I know it will live on in our family as long as we're here.
There's a particular kind of silence that settles over a suburban street in the early evening, the kind that feels ordinary enough to go unnoticed, yet heavy enough to linger if you stop and pay attention. In North Ryde, a quiet suburb in Sydney, that silence once wrapped itself around a modest family home, where nothing, at least from the outside, suggested anything was wrong. The lawns were trimmed, the curtains drawn just enough to keep the afternoon sun from spilling too far inside, and the rhythm of daily life moved along as it always had. It was the kind of place where neighbors might nod in passing, but never think twice about what lay beyond the front door. And yet, behind that door, something had already gone terribly, irreversibly wrong. Because on July 10th, 2001, inside that house, a family of 3 had been killed. Not by a stranger forcing entry, not by some faceless intruder lurking in the dark, but by someone who knew them intimately, someone who had shared their meals, their routines, their trust. But if you had looked at the only surviving member of that household in the hours that followed, you would not have seen panic. You would not have seen grief in the way you might expect. Instead, you would have seen something far more unsettling: composure. A young man sitting in front of a computer, typing messages into online chat rooms, asking questions that sounded almost rehearsed in their concern. "I don't know where my family is," he would say. "Something's wrong." To anyone reading those words, there was nothing immediately alarming. It sounded like worry, like confusion, like the voice of someone trying to make sense of a situation spiraling out of control. But what those people on the other side of the screen did not know, what no one yet fully understood, was that the person typing those words was not searching for answers. He already had them. Every detail, every moment, every last breath taken inside that house. Because earlier that same day, that same young man, SEF Gonzalez, had made a decision that would erase his entire family in a matter of hours. And he would do it not out of rage in the way we typically understand it, not driven by a long history of violence spilling over, but by something quieter, something almost disturbingly mundane, the fear of being exposed. At 18 years old, SEF Gonzalez had constructed a version of himself that did not exist, a carefully maintained illusion built around one central claim, that he was a university student, enrolled and progressing, meeting the expectations placed upon him. Specifically, he told his family he was attending the University of Technology, Sydney, a detail that carried weight, promise, and pride. But beneath that claim was a reality he could not reconcile. He had never enrolled, and he had already been dismissed from his previous school. The life he presented was not just exaggerated, it was entirely fabricated. And as time passed, maintaining that lie became increasingly difficult. Questions began to surface. Small at first, then sharper. His parents, Teddy and Mary Loiva Gonzalez, started to notice inconsistencies, gaps that didn't quite make sense, details that didn't align. And like any parents who had invested their hopes in their child's future, they were preparing to confront him, to demand clarity, to pull back the curtain he had so carefully drawn. For most people, such a moment would lead to confession, perhaps disappointment, perhaps anger, but ultimately a chance to rebuild from the truth. But for SEF Gonzalez, the prospect of that confrontation represented something else entirely. Not just embarrassment, not just failure, but exposure, the complete collapse of the identity he had constructed. And somewhere in the space between being questioned and being revealed, something shifted. Because what happened next was not impulsive in the sense of a sudden outburst, nor was it premeditated in the traditional sense of a long-planned crime. It existed in a more ambiguous, more unsettling place. A decision made in the moment to eliminate the problem entirely. That evening, inside the family home in North Ryde, Teddy Gonzalez would be attacked first. Struck with a baseball bat, then stabbed repeatedly. Mary Loiva Gonzalez, upon discovering what was happening, would meet the same fate, violence carried out with a level of determination that left no room for survival. And then there was Claudine, just 10 years old, too young to understand the full scope of what was unfolding, too young to defend herself against it. She, too, would be killed, in a manner that would later stand as one of the most disturbing aspects of the entire case. 3 lives ended within the walls of a home that, hours earlier, had still functioned as a family. And when it was over, there was no frantic escape, no desperate attempt to flee the scene. Instead, there was method. SEF Gonzalez cleaned up. He washed himself, changed his clothes, and began to construct a narrative, one in which he was not the perpetrator, but the concerned son, the worried brother, the last person left trying to understand why his family had suddenly vanished. And so he turned to the internet, to chat rooms where anonymity made it easy to perform, to rehearse emotion without truly feeling it. He typed messages that mimicked concern, that suggested confusion, that invited sympathy. And perhaps most unsettling of all was not just that he did this, but how convincingly he did it. There was no immediate sign, no obvious crack in the performance that would reveal what had just taken place. It is often said that after a crime, there is a moment, a slip, a fracture in behavior that gives everything away. But in this case, that moment did not come right away. Instead, what investigators would later uncover was something far more complex. A pattern of behavior that did not align with grief, a series of inconsistencies that, when examined closely, began to unravel the story he was trying to tell. Because lies, no matter how carefully constructed, have a way of collapsing under their own weight. And this one, built not just on deception, but on the complete erasure of 3 lives, would eventually do the same. But at the beginning, none of that was visible. At the beginning, all there was silence. A quiet house in North Ryde, a family that would never walk out its front door again, and a young man sitting at a computer, asking questions he already knew the answers to. Because sometimes, the most disturbing crimes are not the ones driven by chaos or uncontrollable rage, but the ones carried out with clarity, with calculation, and followed by calm that feels almost impossible to comprehend. And sometimes, the person who appears to be searching for the truth is the one who has done everything to bury it. To understand what was lost inside that house in North Ryde, it is necessary to step away from the violence for a moment and look as clearly as possible at the people who lived there before everything unraveled. Because cases like this are often remembered for the brutality of the act or the unsettling psychology of the offender. But at their core are individuals whose lives existed fully and meaningfully long before they became part of the headline. Teddy Gonzalez and Mary Loiva Gonzalez were, by all available accounts within the given facts, parents who had placed their hopes firmly in the idea of progress, of stability, of education, of building a future that would extend beyond their own efforts. Their household was structured around those expectations, quiet but firm, the kind that does not always need to be spoken aloud to be understood. Education, in particular, held a central place in that vision. It was not simply about attending classes or earning a degree. It was about upward movement, about fulfilling a promise that many families believe in deeply, that hard work and discipline can secure something better. And in that context, their son, S.E.F. Gonzalez, stood at a critical point in his life. At 18, he was at the threshold between adolescence and adulthood, a stage where identity begins to solidify, where choices start to carry lasting consequences. For Teddy and Mary, this was the moment where years of guidance and expectation would begin to take visible form. They believed their son was enrolled at the University of Technology, Sydney, a detail that would have signaled achievement, direction, and a future aligned with everything they had hoped for. That belief, however, was built entirely on what SEF had told them. In reality, he had not enrolled at the university at all and had already been dismissed from his previous educational path. This discrepancy between perception and reality was not a small misunderstanding or a temporary lapse. It was a sustained fabrication, one that required continuous reinforcement to remain intact. Maintaining such a lie is not a passive act. It demands attention, consistency, and a willingness to adjust details as questions arise. Over time, it becomes a structure, fragile, but elaborate, where each piece depends on the others holding steady. And within the Gonzalez household, that structure began to show signs of strain. Questions, even simple ones, can destabilize a false narrative. Where are your classes? What are you studying? How are your results? These are ordinary inquiries in any family where education is valued, but in this case, they carried an unintended weight, because each answer had to align not with reality, but with the version of reality that had been constructed. And as those questions accumulated, the distance between truth and fiction became harder to manage. Teddy and Mary began to notice inconsistencies, the exact nature of those suspicions within the limits of the known information, centered on a growing awareness that something did not add up. The story they'd been told was no longer holding together in a convincing way. At some point, that suspicion shifted into intent, the intent to confront, to clarify, to bring everything into the open. It is important to pause here and consider what that moment likely represented within the family. Dynamic. A confrontation about education is, in most cases, a difficult but ultimately constructive event. It can involve disappointment, frustration, even anger. But it is also an opportunity to correct course, to acknowledge mistakes, and to move forward with honesty. For Teddy and Mary, this may have been precisely what they intended, to address the issue directly, to understand what had happened, and to guide their son back onto a more stable path. There is nothing in the provided facts to suggest hostility beyond that natural parental concern. They were not enemies. They were not threats in any conventional sense. They were parents asking for the truth. But within the internal world of S.E.F. Gonzalez, that situation appears to have been interpreted very differently. The lie he had constructed was not merely about academic status. It was tied to identity, to self-worth, to the image he presented both at home and potentially beyond it. To admit the truth would not simply be to acknowledge a mistake. It would be to dismantle that identity entirely. And for some individuals, particularly those described as having traits such as emotional detachment or manipulative tendencies, the preservation of that constructed self can take precedence over the consequences of maintaining it. In the same household lived Claudine Gonzalez, 10 years old, the youngest member of the family. At that age, life is defined less by expectation and more by routine, school, home, family, the gradual understanding of the world through daily experience. She existed outside the tension that was building between her brother and their parents. Not because she was unaffected by it, but because she was not its focus. Her presence in the home represented something entirely different: innocence, continuity, the simple fact of being a child in a family that, until that point, still functioned as one. And it is precisely this contrast that makes what followed so difficult to process. Because when examining the background of this case, there is no indication of escalating violence, no documented pattern of physical aggression that would foreshadow the scale of what was about to happen. Instead, what emerges is a different kind of warning sign, one rooted in deception, in the ability to maintain a false narrative over time without visible distress, and in the apparent absence of emotional response to the implications of that deception. The description of S.E.F. Gonzalez within the provided data highlights traits such as emotional detachment, manipulation, and a lack of clear remorse. These characteristics do not, on their own, predict a specific outcome. Many individuals may exhibit aspects of these traits without ever committing violent acts. However, in this context, they form part of a larger pattern, one that becomes significant when combined with the pressure of imminent exposure. The family environment, therefore, can be understood as a convergence point on one side. Parents who valued truth, accountability, and progress on the other. A son who had built a reality that could not withstand scrutiny. And between them, a moment approaching, a conversation that would force that reality to either collapse or be defended. What is striking, in retrospect, is how ordinary the situation appears when viewed from the outside. There is nothing inherently unusual about a family discussing education. Nothing inherently alarming about a young adult struggling to meet expectations. These are common experiences, repeated across countless households. And yet, in this case, that ordinary scenario became the foundation for something extraordinary in its severity. Because the background of this case is not defined by chaos or unpredictability, but by a slow, almost invisible accumulation of pressure. A lie maintained, a suspicion growing, a confrontation approaching, and, at the center of it all, an individual who, rather than preparing to face the consequences of that confrontation, would ultimately choose a path that eliminated it entirely. When we look back at the Gonzalez family before July 10th, 2001, what we see is not a warning that was obvious. Not a trajectory that clearly pointed toward violence, but a set of circumstances that, taken together, created a moment of decision. And it is in that moment, when truth and deception could no longer coexist, that everything changed. On the evening of July 10th, 2001, inside the Gonzalez family home in North Ryde, the ordinary structure of daily life gave way to something far more fragile, something on the verge of collapse. There is no record of raised voices captured in that moment. No transcript of the exact words exchanged, but the context is clear. Tension had been building. Questions had been forming. And the distance between truth and deception had narrowed to the point where it could no longer be ignored. Teddy Gonzalez and Mary Loiva Gonzalez were preparing to confront their son, SEF Gonzalez, about his claims regarding his education. The narrative he had maintained, that he was attending the University of Technology Sydney, was unraveling under scrutiny. And what had once been accepted at face value was now being examined more closely. In many households, such a confrontation would mark a turning point toward honesty. A difficult but necessary conversation that might carry disappointment but ultimately lead to resolution. But in this case, that moment did not lead to confession. Instead, it became the point at which everything shifted irreversibly. The decision that followed was not described as part of a long-term plan, nor was it framed as an uncontrollable outburst of emotion. It existed in a space that is perhaps even more unsettling, a deliberate choice made in response to the immediate threat of exposure. Faced with the prospect of his fabricated identity collapsing, SEF Gonzalez chose not to defend it with further lies, nor to abandon it through admission, but to eliminate the source of the challenge entirely. What followed unfolded within the confines of the family home, a space that had, until that evening, represented safety, routine, and familiarity. The first victim was his father, Teddy Gonzalez. The attack began with a baseball bat, a weapon that required proximity, force, and intention. The act of striking someone with such an object is not incidental. It demands a physical commitment, a willingness to cross a boundary that, once crossed, cannot be reversed. After the initial assault, the violence escalated. A knife was used, and Teddy Gonzalez was stabbed multiple times. The sequence, blunt force followed by repeated stabbing, indicates a continuation, not a pause. An action carried forward rather than reconsidered. There was no indication of hesitation within the known facts. No suggestion that the attack was interrupted or abandoned. It proceeded to its fatal conclusion. Mary Loiva Gonzalez, his mother, became the second victim. The provided information states that she was attacked after discovering what had happened, suggesting that her involvement in the incident was not premeditated in the same sequence as the first, but rather a response to the unfolding situation. Upon encountering the violence already in progress, she was subjected to a similar pattern of attack, multiple stab wounds that resulted in her death. The repetition of method here is significant. It reflects not only the continuation of the initial decision, but its extension to any presence that could challenge or expose what had already been done. And then there was Claudine Gonzalez, 10 years old, the youngest member of the family. At that age, the capacity to understand, to process, or to respond to such a situation is fundamentally limited. She was not part of the confrontation that triggered the events of that evening. She was not a participant in the tension that had been building, and yet she became a victim of it. According to the facts provided, she was stabbed multiple times, and then her throat was cut to ensure that she did not survive. The inclusion of that final act, explicitly described as ensuring death, introduces a level of finality that is difficult to reconcile. It suggests not only violence, but the deliberate removal of any possibility of survival. At this point, the household had been transformed completely. What had begun as a place of routine interaction had become the site of 3 killings, carried out in succession within a limited time frame. There was no indication of external interference, no evidence of an intruder entering or leaving. Everything that occurred did so within the boundaries of the family itself. And yet, even after the violence had ended, the sequence of actions did not shift into panic or disorder. Instead, it moved into something structured, methodical. Following the murders, SEF Gonzalez began to alter the environment around him. He cleaned the scene, an act that implies both awareness and intent, the understanding that what had happened would need to be concealed, at least temporarily. Cleaning in this context is not simply about removing visible traces. It is about reshaping the immediate narrative, about creating a version of the space that does not immediately reveal the truth of what occurred within it. After that, he attended to himself. He showered, changed his clothes, and removed any direct signs of involvement. These actions form a sequence that is often associated with attempts to regain control, to transition from the role of participant in an event to observer of its aftermath. But perhaps the most striking element of what followed was not the physical cleanup, but the behavioral shift that came next. Having completed these steps, SEF Gonzalez did not isolate himself, nor did he attempt to flee. Instead, he engaged with others, indirectly, through the medium of the internet. He entered online chat rooms and began to communicate with acquaintances, presenting himself as concerned, confused, and unaware of his family's whereabouts. He asked questions. He expressed worry. He constructed a narrative in which he was not only uninvolved, but actively seeking answers. This behavior introduces a dimension that extends beyond the physical act of the crime. It reflects what is described in the provided data as social masking, the ability to present an emotional state that does not correspond to internal reality. To those reading his messages, there would have been no immediate indication that anything was amiss. The language of concern is, in itself, familiar and expected in situations where someone believes their family to be missing or in danger. But in this case, that language was being used not to reflect genuine uncertainty, but to simulate it. The timing of these communications is also relevant. They occurred after the murders, after the cleanup, after the transition from action to concealment. This suggests that the performance of concern was not incidental, but part of a broader pattern of behavior that followed the initial act. It was, in effect, an extension of the same decision-making process, the choice to construct a version of events that would distance him from what had actually taken place. When viewed as a whole, the events of that evening do not follow the trajectory of a crime driven purely by impulse or uncontrolled emotion. Instead, they unfold as a sequence, a confrontation anticipated, a decision made, violence carried out, and then a deliberate effort to reshape the narrative that would emerge from it. Each stage connects to the next, forming a continuum rather than a series of isolated actions. And within that continuum, the most unsettling element may not be the violence itself, but the transition that follows it, the ability to move from the role of perpetrator to that of concerned observer without any visible disruption in behavior. By the time the night had ended, 3 members of the Gonzalez family were dead, and the only surviving individual within the household had already begun to position himself as something else entirely. From the outside, nothing had yet been formally uncovered. There were no public accusations, no confirmed timeline. There was only a developing situation, one that, at that stage, still allowed for multiple interpretations. But beneath that uncertainty lay a reality that would, in time, become impossible to conceal. Because while actions can be hidden, altered, or reframed, they leave traces, physical, behavioral, and logical. And in the days that followed, those traces would begin to surface, slowly at first. Then, with increasing clarity, until the narrative that had been constructed could no longer hold. But on that night, in the immediate aftermath, what remained was a quiet house, a completed act, and a carefully initiated performance, one that, for a brief period, would obscure the truth of what had taken place inside. In the immediate aftermath of the events inside the Gonzalez family home, there is no single moment where the truth revealed itself all at once. Instead, the investigation unfolded in layers, each one peeling back a portion of the narrative that SEF Gonzalez had begun to construct in the hours following the murders. At first glance, the situation presented itself with a degree of ambiguity. A family was dead inside their own home, and the only surviving member was the son who claimed confusion, concern, and a lack of understanding about what had occurred. In many cases, such a claim might be treated as the starting point of an external investigation, a search for an unknown intruder, a reconstruction of movements, a hunt for someone who had entered and left without being seen. But in this case, the absence of certain elements would prove just as significant as the presence of others. One of the earliest observations was the lack of forced entry. There were no signs that someone had broken into the home, no indication of struggle at entry points, no disruption that would suggest an outsider had gained access through conventional means. This detail alone does not immediately eliminate all external possibilities, but it does narrow the scope. It shifts the focus inward toward those who had legitimate access to the space. And in this scenario, that group was extremely limited. As investigators began to assess the scene more closely, the internal nature of the crime became increasingly difficult to ignore. The violence had occurred within the home against members of the same family, without any clear evidence of an external presence. This naturally raised questions about the dynamics within the household, about relationships, about potential conflicts that might not have been visible from the outside. It also brought attention, inevitably, to the behavior of the only surviving individual. From the beginning, SEF Gonzalez presented himself as cooperative, as someone willing to provide information and assist in understanding what had happened. But cooperation, in itself, does not equate to credibility. And as his statements were examined more closely, inconsistencies began to emerge. These inconsistencies were not necessarily dramatic on their own. Rather, they accumulated over time, forming a pattern that became increasingly difficult to reconcile. Details did not align. Timelines shifted. Explanations lacked coherence when compared against the physical evidence. In investigative work, it is often not a single contradiction that raises suspicion, but the repetition of smaller discrepancies that fail to resolve under scrutiny. Each inconsistency introduces a question, and when those questions begin to overlap, they create pressure on the narrative being presented. Alongside these developing concerns, investigators turn to available sources of objective data, records that exist independently of personal testimony. Among the most significant of these in this case were digital communications. The chat logs from the online conversations SEF Gonzalez had engaged in after the murders provided a unique window into his behavior during a critical time frame. On the surface, these messages appeared consistent with his stated position. He expressed concern, asked about his family, and presented himself as someone searching for answers. But when placed within the broader context of the timeline, their significance shifted. These were not messages sent in genuine uncertainty. They were sent after the events had already occurred, after the victims had already died. This temporal disconnect introduced a critical point of analysis. The emotional tone of the messages, concern, confusion, urgency, did not align with the underlying reality. This is where the concept described in the provided data as social masking becomes particularly relevant. Social masking involves the presentation of an emotional state that does not reflect internal experience. Often used to navigate social situations, or maintain a certain image. In this case, the chat logs can be understood as a form of that masking, an attempt to project the expected behavior of someone in distress, without the corresponding internal state. For investigators, this was not merely a psychological observation. It was a behavioral inconsistency that required explanation. Why would someone express concern about a situation they already understood fully? Why would the timing of those messages align so precisely with a period after the crime had been completed? These questions did not provide immediate answers, but they contributed to a growing sense that the narrative being presented was constructed rather than authentic. At the same time, forensic analysis of the scene provided additional points of reference. While the provided data does not detail specific forensic findings, it establishes that the physical evidence did not support the presence of an unknown intruder and did not align with SEF Gonzalez's account. This misalignment is crucial. In any investigation, the relationship between physical evidence and witness statements serves as a fundamental check on accuracy. When those two elements correspond, they reinforce each other. When they diverge, one or both must be reevaluated. In this case, the divergence placed increasing weight on the possibility that the statements being provided were unreliable. As the investigation progressed, the cumulative effect of these factors, lack of forced entry, inconsistent statements, and contradictory behavioral evidence, began to narrow the range of plausible explanations. The idea of an external perpetrator became less tenable. The focus shifted more directly toward the internal dynamics of the household and, specifically, toward the individual whose account could not be reconciled with the available facts. This shift does not occur instantly. It develops through a process of elimination, where each alternative explanation is tested and found lacking. Eventually, what remains is not simply the most likely scenario, but the only scenario that accounts for all observed evidence. The turning point in such cases is often less about discovering something entirely new and more about recognizing that the existing pieces, when assembled correctly, point in a single direction. For SEF Gonzalez, maintaining the constructed narrative became increasingly difficult as this process unfolded. A fabricated account must remain consistent across multiple retellings under varying conditions and in response to new information. Any deviation introduces doubt, and repeated deviations can lead to the collapse of the entire structure. As pressure from investigators increased, the capacity to sustain that narrative diminished. Each inconsistency required adjustment, and each adjustment created further opportunities for contradiction. The investigation, therefore, became not just a search for external evidence, but an examination of internal coherence, of whether the story being told could withstand systematic scrutiny. It could not. By the time the key elements had been analyzed and compared, the conclusion was no longer ambiguous. The absence of external indicators, combined with the presence of behavioral and testimonial inconsistencies, led investigators to identify SEF Gonzalez as the perpetrator. This identification was not based on a single piece of evidence, but on the convergence of multiple independent lines of inquiry, all pointing toward the same outcome. What began as a case with outward uncertainty had been transformed, through methodical analysis, into a coherent reconstruction of events. The narrative that had been initially presented, of confusion, concern, and external threat, was replaced by one grounded in evidence. A sequence of actions carried out within the home, followed by an attempt to conceal both the physical and behavioral traces of those actions. And at the center of that reconstruction was the recognition that the performance of innocence had, in itself, become one of the most revealing aspects of the case. Because in attempting to simulate concern, SEF Gonzalez had introduced a pattern of behavior that could not be aligned with the reality of the situation. The very act of pretending to search for answers had, ultimately, contributed to the process of uncovering them. By the end of the investigative phase, the lie that had initiated the events of July 10th, 2001 had expanded into something far larger, a constructed reality that encompassed not only his academic status, but his role in the aftermath of the crime. And like the original lie, it could not withstand sustained examination. What remained, once it had been dismantled, was a clear, if deeply disturbing, account of what had taken place inside the Gonzalez family home and who was responsible for it. By the time the case against S.E.F. Gonzalez reached the courtroom in 2004, the uncertainty that had once surrounded the events of July 10th, 2001 had been replaced by a structured narrative built on evidence, analysis, and the gradual dismantling of the story he had attempted to present. A trial, in cases such as this, is not merely a retelling of events, but a process through which competing interpretations are examined, challenged, and ultimately resolved within a legal framework. It is where facts are organized, where behavior is contextualized, and where the question of responsibility is addressed with finality. For the court, the task was clear: to determine whether the evidence established, beyond reasonable doubt, that S.E.F. Gonzalez had committed the murders of his father, Teddy Gonzalez, his mother, Mary Loiva Gonzalez, and his 10-year-old sister, Claudine Gonzalez. The charges themselves were direct, 3 counts of murder, but the path to those charges had involved the careful accumulation of details that, when presented together, formed a coherent and compelling account of what had occurred. Central to the prosecution's case was the issue of motive. Unlike cases driven by financial gain or long-standing conflict, this one rested on something less tangible but no less significant: the fear of exposure. The narrative established during the investigation that S.E.F. Gonzalez had fabricated his academic status, claiming to be enrolled at the University of Technology, Sydney, when he was not, provided the foundation for understanding why the confrontation on the evening of July 10th carried such weight. The prosecution argued that this lie, sustained over time and increasingly difficult to maintain, had reached a breaking point when his parents began to question it more directly. Faced with the imminent collapse of that fabrication, he chose to eliminate those who could expose it. This framing did not rely on speculation beyond the provided facts. Rather, it connected established elements: the deception, the growing suspicion, and the timing of the murders, into a sequence that explained the transition from tension to violence. Alongside motive, the prosecution emphasized behavior, particularly in the period immediately following the murders. The actions taken by S.E.F. Gonzalez, cleaning the scene, showering, changing clothes, and engaging in online chat conversations in which he expressed concern for his family, were presented not as isolated events, but as components of a broader attempt to construct an alternative narrative. The chat logs, in particular, played a significant role. These digital records provided a time-stamped account of his communications, allowing the court to examine not only what was said, but when it was said. The contrast between the content of those messages and the established timeline of the murders introduced a critical inconsistency. Expressions of concern were made after the deaths had already occurred, creating a disconnect that required explanation. The prosecution's interpretation was that these messages represented an effort to simulate innocence, to present himself as a worried family member rather than the perpetrator. This interpretation aligned with the broader pattern of behavior identified during the investigation, including the inconsistencies in his statements and the lack of evidence supporting the presence of an external intruder. The defense, within the constraints of the case, was tasked with challenging this narrative, questioning the interpretation of evidence, and highlighting any areas of uncertainty. In any trial, the defense does not need to provide an alternative explanation that is fully formed. It must instead introduce reasonable doubt regarding the prosecution's claims. However, in this instance, the convergence of evidence, behavioral, testimonial, and forensic limited the scope for such doubt. The absence of forced entry, the internal nature of the crime scene, and the inconsistencies in S.E.F. Gonzalez's account collectively narrowed the range of plausible explanations. Each element reinforced the others, creating a structure that was difficult to dismantle through isolated challenges. As the trial progressed, the court was presented with a sequence of events that, while deeply disturbing, was internally consistent. The confrontation over the fabricated academic status, the subsequent decision to commit the murders, the methodical actions taken afterward to conceal involvement and construct a narrative of concern, and the eventual breakdown of that narrative under investigative scrutiny. The role of the court at this stage was not to speculate beyond the evidence, but to assess whether the evidence, as presented, met the required standard for conviction. This assessment involves not only the examination of individual pieces of evidence, but their relationship to one another, how they align, where they diverge, and whether they collectively support a single, coherent conclusion. In delivering its verdict, the court found that they did. S.E.F. Gonzalez was convicted of 3 counts of murder. The decision reflected the court's determination that the evidence established his responsibility for the deaths of his father, mother, and sister, and that the explanations he had provided were not consistent with the facts. Sentencing in such cases serves both as a legal consequence and as a statement about the severity of the offense. The loss of 3 lives, particularly within a single family, represents a level of harm that extends beyond the immediate act, affecting not only those directly involved, but the broader community as well. In this instance, the sentence imposed was life imprisonment, with a non-parole period of at least 40 years. This means that, under the terms of the sentence, S.E.F. Gonzalez would not be eligible for release for a minimum of 4 decades. Such a sentence reflects the court's recognition of multiple factors: the number of victims, the nature of the violence, the circumstances under which the crimes were committed, and the absence of mitigating elements that would warrant a lesser penalty. It is important to note that sentencing is not an attempt to restore what has been lost. It cannot reverse the events of July 10th, nor can it return the lives that were taken. Instead, it functions as a formal acknowledgement of responsibility and a mechanism for imposing consequences within the boundaries of the legal system. For the Gonzalez family, the trial marked the final stage of a process that had begun with uncertainty and ended with clarity. However painful that clarity may be, the courtroom proceedings transformed a fragmented and contested narrative into an official record, one that established, in legal terms, what had occurred and who was accountable. And yet, even within that resolution, certain aspects of the case remain difficult to reconcile. The motive, rooted in the fear of exposure over a fabricated identity, does not align with the scale of the response. The behavior following the murders, characterized by composure and the performance of concern, challenges conventional expectations of emotional response. These elements do not undermine the verdict. Rather, they underscore the complexity of the case, highlighting the gap between the actions themselves and the reasoning that led to them. By the conclusion of the trial, the legal questions had been answered. Responsibility had been assigned. A sentence had been imposed. But beyond the structure of the courtroom, beyond the formal language of charges and verdicts, the case continued to exist as something more than a resolved legal matter. It remained, and continues to remain, an example of how ordinary circumstances, family expectations, personal failure, the fear of being exposed, can intersect with individual psychology in ways that produce outcomes far beyond what those circumstances would typically suggest. And it is in that intersection between the ordinary and the extreme that the full weight of the case becomes most apparent. When the legal process concluded and the sentence was handed down, the case of the Gonzalez family moved from an active investigation into something else entirely, something quieter, but no less significant. Because while a courtroom can establish facts, assign responsibility, and impose consequences, it cannot fully account for what remains afterward. It cannot measure absence, nor can it restore what has been taken. And in this case, what remained was defined as much by what was no longer there as by what had been proven. 3 lives, Teddy Gonzalez, Mary Loiva Gonzalez, and 10-year-old Claudine Gonzalez, had been ended within the space of their own home, in a sequence of events that unfolded not because of long-standing violence or external threat, but because of a single sustained deception that could no longer be maintained. The finality of that loss is difficult to articulate in precise terms. It exists beyond the structure of the trial, beyond the language of evidence and verdicts, in the simple reality that a family ceased to exist in the form it once had. There is no continuation of routine, no gradual adjustment, no opportunity for reconciliation. The narrative ends abruptly, replaced by a record of what occurred and the knowledge that there will be no further chapters for those who were lost. At the center of that absence is the recognition that the events of July 10th, 2001 did not arise from a set of circumstances that are inherently rare or extraordinary. Families experience tension. Young adults struggle with expectations. Individuals make mistakes, conceal them, and attempt to manage the consequences. These are elements that appear in various forms across countless lives. What distinguishes this case is not the presence of those elements, but the response to them. Because the decision made by SEF Gonzalez to eliminate the source of potential exposure rather than confront it transformed an otherwise ordinary situation into an irreversible outcome. This transformation invites a form of reflection that extends beyond the specifics of the case itself. It raises questions about how pressure is perceived, how identity is constructed, and how certain individuals respond when that identity is threatened. Within the provided information, SEF Gonzalez is described as exhibiting traits such as emotional detachment, manipulation, and a lack of clear remorse. Characteristics that are often associated with conditions like antisocial personality disorder or sociopathic tendencies. It is important, however, to approach these descriptions with precision. They do not function as explanations that justify or excuse behavior. Rather, they provide a framework for understanding patterns that may have contributed to the decisions made. The concept of social masking, referenced earlier in the case, is particularly relevant in this context. It refers to the ability to present emotions that align with social expectations, even when those emotions are not genuinely experienced. In the aftermath of the murders, this ability manifested in the form of online communications, messages that conveyed concern, confusion, and distress, despite the fact that their author was fully aware of the reality of the situation. This dissonance between outward expression and internal state is one of the most unsettling aspects of the case, not because it is entirely unique, but because of the extent to which it was sustained under circumstances that would typically produce visible emotional disruption. It challenges assumptions about how individuals behave after committing acts of violence, suggesting that the absence of expected reactions can, in itself, be a form of concealment. At the same time, the case highlights the limitations of outward observation. From an external perspective, there were no clear indicators that such an outcome was imminent. There was no widely documented pattern of escalating violence, no obvious trajectory leading directly to the events that occurred. Instead, the warning signs, if they can be described as such, were embedded in less visible behaviors. Prolonged deception, the maintenance of a fabricated identity, and the increasing difficulty of sustaining that identity under scrutiny. These elements, while significant in retrospect, do not always present themselves in a way that is easily recognized or interpreted in real time. This raises a broader question about the nature of risk and recognition. How do individuals, families, or communities identify when a situation is moving beyond the range of typical conflict and into something more dangerous? In many cases, the answer is not clear. The absence of overt violence can create a sense of normalcy, even when underlying tensions are present, and when those tensions are internalized rather than expressed. They may remain undetected until they reach a point of crisis. In the Gonzalez case, that crisis emerged suddenly, without the kind of gradual escalation that might have prompted earlier intervention. Another dimension of reflection lies in the nature of the motive itself. The killings were not carried out for financial gain, nor were they the result of a prolonged dispute characterized by hostility or resentment. Instead, they were driven by the fear of being exposed, the fear that a constructed identity would collapse under scrutiny. This type of motive does not align with common perceptions of why individuals commit acts of extreme violence. It is, in a sense, disproportionate to the circumstances that triggered it. And yet, it underscores a critical point, that the significance of a situation is not determined solely by its objective characteristics, but by how it is perceived and processed by the individual involved. For SEF Gonzalez, the potential exposure of his deception appears to have been interpreted not as a manageable consequence, but as an existential threat to his identity. That interpretation, combined with the traits described in the provided data, created a context in which an extreme response became, in his perception, a viable option. This does not make the response understandable in a conventional sense, nor does it render it predictable. But it does illustrate how the intersection of personal psychology and situational pressure can produce outcomes that diverge sharply from what might be expected. In considering the aftermath of the case, it is also important to acknowledge the broader implications for how such events are understood and remembered. True crime narratives, by their nature, often focus on the details of the crime and the characteristics of the offender. While these elements are essential for understanding what occurred, they can sometimes overshadow the individuals who were affected most directly. In this instance, the names of Teddy Gonzalez, Mary Loiva Gonzalez, and Claudine Gonzalez represent more than their roles within the case. They represent lives that were lived prior to the events of July 10th. Lives that included experiences, relationships, and identities that cannot be fully captured within the confines of a single narrative. Remembering them requires a shift in focus from the actions of the perpetrator to the impact of those actions on the people who were lost. It also requires an acknowledgement that the case does not end with the conclusion of the trial. The legal resolution provides closure in a procedural sense, but the effects of the event extend beyond that point, influencing how similar situations are perceived, discussed, and, in some cases, addressed in the future. Finally, there's the question that remains after all facts have been established and all explanations have been considered. What, if anything, can be learned from this case? The answer is not straightforward, and it does not present itself in the form of a single, definitive conclusion. Instead, it exists in a series of considerations. The importance of recognizing the potential impact of sustained deception. The need to understand how individuals respond to pressure, particularly when that pressure threatens their sense of identity. The limitations of external observation in identifying internal conflict, and the reality that not all acts of violence are preceded by visible warning signs. These considerations do not provide a means of preventing all such events, nor do they offer a way to fully comprehend the decisions that led to them. but they do contribute to a broader understanding of the factors that can, under certain conditions, converge to produce outcomes of this nature. In the end, the case of the Gonzalez family does not resolve into a simple narrative of cause and effect. It remains, instead, a complex intersection of ordinary circumstances and extraordinary consequences. A reminder that the boundaries between the two are not always as clearly defined as they might appear, and that sometimes the most profound impact of a case lies not in the details of what happened, but in the questions that remain after everything else has been answered. There is a tendency, when a case reaches its legal conclusion, to treat it as something complete, as though the verdict itself draws a definitive boundary between what happened and what remains. But some cases resist that kind of closure. They linger, not because the facts are unclear, but because the simplicity of those facts stands in stark contrast to the depth of their consequences. The case of S.E.F. Gonzalez is one of those cases. At its core, it can be reduced to a sequence that is almost disturbingly straightforward. A lie was told, that lie was threatened, and in response, 3 lives were taken. And yet, the simplicity of that sequence is precisely what makes it so difficult to reconcile, because it forces a confrontation with a question that does not have an easy answer. How can something so ordinary, a lie about education, about status, about expectation, expand into something so final? In the time that followed the trial, the details of the case remained fixed. The date did not change. The location did not shift. The outcome remained the same. What evolved instead was the way the case was understood. Not in terms of evidence or legal interpretation, but in terms of meaning. Cases like this often become reference points, not because they're the most complex or the most violent, but because they challenge assumptions in ways that are difficult to ignore. There is no elaborate conspiracy here, no hidden network of motives waiting to be uncovered. There's only a single individual, a constructed identity, and a moment when that identity could no longer be sustained. And in that moment, a decision was made that cannot be undone. It is tempting to search for a defining moment, a clear psychological break, something that marks the transition from deception to violence. But within the constraints of what is known, that moment does not present itself in a way that can be easily isolated. There is no documented escalation that builds toward inevitability, no series of events that clearly signal what is about to happen. Instead, there is a gradual accumulation of pressure, questions asked, inconsistencies noticed, expectations closing in, and then, at a point that cannot be precisely measured, that pressure intersects with a mindset that does not process consequence in the same way most people do. The result is not an explosion of emotion, but a decision that appears from the outside, both abrupt and calculated. What makes this case particularly enduring is not just the act itself, but what followed it. The attempt to reconstruct reality through behavior, to clean, to reset, to perform concern, introduces a dimension that extends beyond the physical events of that evening. It suggests a separation between action and emotion that is difficult to comprehend. The ability to move from violence to composure, from action to performance, without an observable transition, disrupts the expectation that such acts are accompanied by visible psychological disturbance. Instead, what is presented is a form of continuity, a seamless shift from one role to another, as though the two could coexist without conflict. This raises a broader consideration about how truth and appearance interact. In everyday life, people rely on behavioral cues to interpret the intentions and states of others. Concern is read as concern. Confusion is read as confusion. These interpretations form the basis of trust, of social interaction, of the assumptions that allow individuals to navigate the world without constant doubt. But cases like this expose the limitations of those assumptions. They demonstrate that behavior can be constructed, that emotional signals can be replicated without being genuinely felt, and that the absence of visible distress does not necessarily indicate the absence of underlying reality. At the same time, it is important not to extend this realization into a generalized suspicion of all behavior. The rarity of such cases lies precisely in how far they deviate from typical human response. Most individuals, when faced with exposure or failure, do not respond with violence. They experience consequences, they adapt, they move forward. The fact that this case stands out is a reflection of how uncommon its trajectory is. And yet, its existence serves as a reminder that the range of human behavior includes possibilities that fall outside the expected spectrum. There's also a quieter aspect to the aftermath, one that does not center on the perpetrator at all, but on the absence left behind. Teddy Gonzalez, Mary Loiva Gonzalez, and Claudine Gonzalez are often referenced within the context of the case. Their names tied to the events of a single day, but their lives extended far beyond that day. They existed within routines, relationships, and experiences that are not captured in investigative summaries or courtroom transcripts. The reduction of those lives to their final moments is, in some ways, an unavoidable consequence of how such cases are documented. And yet, it is worth recognizing that the impact of their loss cannot be fully expressed through the details of the crime alone. In reflecting on this case, there is no single lesson that resolves its complexity. There is no clear guideline that emerges, no definitive statement that can encompass everything it represents. What remains instead is a series of considerations about the nature of identity, about the role of truth, about the ways in which individuals respond to the possibility of being seen as they are, rather than as they wish to be perceived. The lie at the center of this case was not, in itself, unique. People misrepresent themselves in countless ways for countless reasons. But what followed that lie transformed it into something else entirely, something that extended beyond deception into irreversible consequence. And perhaps that is where the weight of this case ultimately resides. Not in the violence alone, though that violence is undeniable. Not in the legal outcome, though it provides structure and resolution. But in the recognition that a boundary was crossed. A boundary between what can be corrected and what cannot. Between what can be revealed and what must remain hidden because there is no one left to hear it. Because in the end, the truth did emerge. It was established, examined, and confirmed. But it arrived in a form that offered no opportunity for response. No chance for understanding from those who had been silenced. There is a final image that lingers, not as a dramatization, but as a reflection of contrast. A quiet house, unchanged from the outside, and within it, the absence of everything that once gave it meaning. No voices, no movement, no continuation. And beyond that house, a world that continues as it always does, carrying forward without pause. Cases like this do not stop that movement, but they do leave an imprint, a point of reflection that remains long after the immediate details have faded. Because sometimes the most enduring impact of a story is not found in what it reveals, but in what it forces us to confront. And in this case, what it confronts us with is both simple and difficult to accept. That the distance between an ordinary lie and an irreversible act is not always defined by the lie itself, but by the person who chooses how to respond when that lie can no longer be sustained. In the end, what remains after a case like this is not a sense of resolution in the traditional sense, but a quiet recognition of limits to what can be explained, what can be prevented, and what can ever truly be understood. The story of S.E.F. Gonzalez does not unfold as a mystery that leaves unanswered questions about who was responsible or how events took place. Those questions have been addressed, examined, and resolved within the structure of the investigation and the courtroom. Instead, what lingers are the questions that exist beyond those facts, the ones that do not alter the outcome, but continue to shape how it is perceived. Questions about decision, about perception, about the internal processes that transform a moment of pressure into an act of irreversible consequence. And perhaps most significantly, questions about timing, about the point at which truth becomes unavoidable, and whether that moment arrives early enough to matter. Because in this case, truth did emerge. It surfaced through inconsistencies, through evidence, through the gradual breakdown of a narrative that could not withstand scrutiny. But by the time it did, it no longer had the power to change what had already happened. The confrontation that Teddy Gonzalez and Mary Loiva Gonzalez were preparing, the one that might have forced honesty, that might have led to disappointment, but also to resolution, never reached its intended conclusion. It was interrupted, replaced by an outcome that removed the possibility of dialogue entirely. And in that sense, the truth arrived too late. Not in the investigative sense, where timing is measured in hours and days, but in the human sense, where timing determines whether an action can still be undone, whether a conversation can still take place, whether a mistake can still be corrected. This distinction between factual resolution and human resolution is important. The legal system is designed to establish accountability, to define responsibility, and to impose consequences in a structured and consistent manner. It does this through evidence, through procedure, through the careful evaluation of what can be proven. But it does not and cannot address the full scope of what is lost when an event like this occurs. It cannot recreate the moment before the decision was made, cannot reintroduce the possibility of a different outcome, cannot restore the continuity that was broken. And so, while the case reaches a conclusion in one sense, it remains open in another, existing as a point of reflection rather than a closed narrative. Part of that reflection involves examining the nature of the pressure that preceded the crime. The fear of exposure, the anxiety associated with being confronted, the potential loss of identity tied to a constructed version of oneself. These are not, in isolation, extraordinary experiences. They are, to varying degrees, part of the human condition. People navigate expectations, manage perceptions, and sometimes struggle with the gap between who they are and who they present themselves to be. What distinguishes this case is not the presence of that struggle, but the response to it. Because while many individuals face moments where truth threatens to disrupt their self-image, very few interpret that threat as something that can only be resolved through elimination of the source. The divergence occurs not at the level of circumstance, but at the level of interpretation, how the situation is perceived, and what options are considered viable in response. The behavior that followed the crime adds another layer to this reflection. The act of engaging in online conversations, of expressing concern, of asking questions about the whereabouts of a family that had already been killed. This is not simply an attempt to mislead others. It is an attempt to occupy a role, to inhabit a version of reality that no longer exists. It suggests a capacity to separate action from presentation, to construct an external narrative that operates independently of internal truth. This separation challenges conventional assumptions about emotional response, particularly in the aftermath of extreme events. It introduces the possibility that behavior, even when it appears consistent with expected emotional states, may not always correspond to them. At the same time, it is essential to maintain perspective on the rarity of such behavior. The vast majority of individuals do not possess, or do not exercise, the capacity to carry out acts of violence followed by sustained performance of normalcy. The existence of this case does not redefine human behavior as a whole. It highlights an exception. one that stands out precisely because it deviates so sharply from what is typical. And yet, within that exception, there are elements that resonate more broadly: the role of identity, the impact of expectation, the consequences of deception when it is allowed to persist unchecked. There is also an element of silence that persists beyond the conclusion of the case. Not the silence of uncertainty, but the silence of absence. The absence of Teddy Gonzalez, of Mary Loiva Gonzalez, of Claudine Gonzalez. Their lives, once part of an ongoing narrative, are now fixed at a single point in time. Their futures defined not by what they might have become, but by the moment in which they were taken. This form of silence does not demand attention in the way that active conflict does, but it remains constant and unchanging as a reminder of what has been lost. In reflecting on this case, it becomes clear that not all stories offer a form of closure that feels complete. Some conclude with answers, but without resolution. Some provide clarity, but leave behind a sense of incompleteness that cannot be addressed through further information. The case of the Gonzalez family is one of those stories. It does not leave us wondering what happened, but it does leave us considering why and how, and whether anything could have altered the course of events before they reached their final outcome. And perhaps the most difficult aspect of that reflection is the recognition that the answer to that last question may never be fully known, because the moment in which a different decision could have been made, the moment where truth could have been acknowledged rather than avoided, is not accessible in the way that physical evidence or recorded statements are. It exists only as a point of divergence, a possibility that was present but not taken. In the end, the story returns to where it began: a quiet home, a family, a version of reality that seemed stable from the outside. And within that space, a lie that grew until it could no longer be sustained. When it finally collapsed, it did not lead to correction or reconciliation, but to something far more permanent. And by the time the truth emerged, it arrived in a context where it could no longer serve its most essential purpose, not to assign blame, but to allow for change. Because truth, when it comes early enough, can alter outcomes. It can redirect decisions, repair misunderstandings, and create the possibility of moving forward. But when it comes too late, it becomes something else entirely. It becomes a record, a conclusion, a final statement of what is rather than what could have been. And in this case, that distinction is what defines everything that remains. There's a point in every deception where the effort required to maintain it begins to outweigh the simplicity of telling the truth. For most people, that point becomes a turning moment, a quiet recalibration where the cost of continuing the lie becomes too great, and the truth, however uncomfortable, becomes the more viable option. But the case of SEF Gonzalez stands apart because that moment did arrive. And yet the choice that followed did not align with what we would expect. Instead of confession, instead of correction, there was a shift toward concealment at its most extreme form, a transition from managing a false narrative to eliminating anything that could expose it. And it is within that transition that the full weight of this case becomes most apparent. Because concealment, in its ordinary sense, is a defensive act. It is an attempt to delay consequences to preserve an image, to maintain control over how one is perceived. It operates within boundaries, constrained by the understanding that, eventually, reality will reassert itself. But in this case, concealment did not remain within those boundaries. It expanded, crossing into a space where the objective was no longer to manage perception, but to remove the very conditions under which perception could be challenged. The confrontation that Teddy Gonzalez and Mary Loiva Gonzalez were approaching represented a moment where the constructed identity of their son could no longer exist without being tested. It was a point of inevitability. And faced with that inevitability, the response was not to engage with it, but to erase it. This raises a question that extends beyond the specifics of the case. What differentiates a lie that remains within the realm of everyday human behavior from one that escalates into something far more destructive? The answer does not lie in the content of the lie itself. The claim of attending the University of Technology, Sydney, while significant within the family context, is not, on its own, extraordinary. People misrepresent their achievements, their status, their progress. These misrepresentations can lead to conflict, to disappointment, to fractured trust, but they do not typically lead to violence. The difference, therefore, must be found elsewhere in the interpretation of the consequences, in the internal framework through which those consequences are evaluated, and in the range of responses that are considered acceptable or necessary. In examining that framework, the traits described within the case, emotional detachment, manipulation, the absence of clear remorse, become relevant not as labels, but as indicators of how decisions may be processed. Emotional detachment can create distance between action and empathy, reducing the immediate impact of considering harm to others. Manipulative tendencies can reinforce the belief that reality can be shaped or controlled through deliberate action, and the absence of remorse can remove a key barrier that, for many individuals, prevents harmful behavior from being carried out. When these elements intersect with a situation where exposure is imminent, the range of perceived options may narrow in a way that excludes responses grounded in accountability or acceptance. Yet even within this framework, there remains a critical distinction between possibility and inevitability. The presence of these traits does not predetermine a specific outcome. It does not guarantee that violence will occur. What it does is alter the landscape of decision-making, changing how situations are interpreted and how responses are evaluated. In this case, that altered landscape included a path that most individuals would not consider, or would immediately reject. And it was that path that was chosen. The events that followed, the attacks on Teddy Gonzalez, Mary Loiva Gonzalez, and Claudine Gonzalez, the subsequent efforts to clean the scene, the performance of concern through online communication, form a sequence that is internally consistent, but externally difficult to reconcile. They suggest a continuity of intent, a progression from the initial decision through to the attempt at constructing a new narrative. There is no clear interruption, no moment where the process appears to falter. And this continuity contributes to the sense that the actions were not fragmented but connected, each one reinforcing the next. In the aftermath, as the investigation unfolded and the inconsistencies in the constructed narrative became apparent, the process of concealment began to break down. This breakdown was not sudden. It occurred through the accumulation of contradictions, through the comparison of statements with evidence, through the recognition that the behavior being presented did not align with the underlying reality. And as that process continued, the space for maintaining the original narrative diminished. What had been an attempt to control perception became increasingly unsustainable until it could no longer be maintained at all. The legal outcome, conviction and life imprisonment, provide the formal conclusion to this process. It establishes accountability, defines responsibility, and imposes a consequence that reflects the severity of the actions. But it does not and cannot fully address the underlying dynamics that led to those actions. It does not resolve the tension between the ordinary nature of the initial lie and the extraordinary nature of its outcome. Instead, it exists alongside that tension, offering structure without fully resolving the questions that remain. And those questions persist, not because the facts are incomplete, but because they point toward broader considerations that extend beyond the case itself. They invite reflection on how individuals navigate the relationship between identity and truth, on how pressure is experienced and interpreted, and on how the boundaries of acceptable behavior are defined and, in rare cases, crossed. They also highlight the importance of recognizing that not all conflicts, not all deceptions, carry the same potential for escalation. Most remain within manageable limits, resolved through communication, consequence, and adjustment. But some, under specific conditions, can move beyond those limits in ways that are difficult to anticipate. In a final analysis, the case of the Gonzalez family does not offer a clear line that separates safety from danger, or normal behavior from extreme action. Instead, it reveals how that line can be approached gradually through decisions that, in isolation, may not appear significant, but collectively create a situation where the margin for resolution narrows. And when that margin disappears, when the possibility of maintaining a constructed reality collides with the inevitability of exposure, the outcome depends entirely on how that moment is addressed. For most, it is addressed through acceptance, through the acknowledgement that truth, however uncomfortable, is preferable to the consequences of its avoidance. But in this case, that acceptance did not occur. The moment passed, the decision was made, and the consequences became permanent. And what remains, after everything has been examined and understood as fully as possible, is the recognition that the distance between concealment and consequence is not fixed. It is defined in each instance by the choices that are made when truth can no longer be avoided.